This is the podcast on natural selection, so you want to put this as a heading with your date. Okay, just a little bit of review first. You do want to write this down, however. We've been talking about Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace in class a little bit, so we kind of want to pull all that together into a couple ideas here. Between the work of Darwin and Wallace, they had two main ideas that they came up with during their time period, and that was number one, that evolution explains why life seems to be unified, so why there seems to be some relationships between some organisms, but also how it could be so different, how different organisms can look so different from each other at the same time that they share other traits. And then they came up with this idea of how evolution actually happens, and that's called natural selection. So natural selection is the cause for this adaptive evolution that they were seeing. All right, so they came up with the idea of natural selection, and we're going to use the ideas of a biologist named Ernst Mayr, who kind of put his ideas, Darwin's ideas, into some observations and inferences. The observations are pretty clear, things that we can see about the world. The inferences are, things that we can figure out from these observations. So we're going to go through those, and I would like you to write those down. This isn't so important to write down, but do write down these following observations and inferences. So observation number one, what do we see in the world around us? For any species, a population size would increase exponentially if all individuals that are born reproduce successfully. Okay, so what does that mean in kind of plain English? That means if all of the babies that were born to a particular species actually survived, we would have growth that would be off the charts. Maybe you remember from when we talked about different types of population growth way back when, but an exponential growth curve looks like this. Okay, it just keeps going up and up and up. So if every single organism that was born actually survived, we would have a huge growth curve for all those organisms. All right, an example of that, if you think about seeds, this is a type of ash tree, actually a white ash, and you see that all of those different seeds are on there, those little helicopter-looking seeds. You can imagine every single one of those seeds turned into a white ash tree, how quickly we would populate the world with these white ashes. In reality, as you well know, only a handful of those seeds may survive, find the right conditions to thrive and grow into a full tree. So that's the first observation. Second observation, populations tend to be stable in size except for seasonal fluctuations. So instead of seeing this exponential growth like we were saying, populations actually do reach a carrying capacity. So once they get established, they level out. Remember that graph, hopefully. And at this point where they level out, that means that they are stable. Same amount of organisms that are being born are also dying. Immigration and emigration are equal. All right, so we put these observations together, and what do we get? First inference, observation 3. Forgot one more. We also know that resources are limited, and that's part of the reason why our population is going to stabilize, because we don't always have enough food to keep the population getting bigger and bigger, or water, or shelter, or whatever. So again, we put these three together, and we get our first inference. Production of more individuals than the environment can support. So if there is a point where we have more offspring than the environment can feed or shelter, means there's a struggle for existence among individuals. So some individuals survive, some do not. Again, if we think back to the ash tree seeds, the ones that land in a good environment where there's plenty of sunlight and they're protected and they get water, those will survive. The ones that don't land in a very good environment are not going to survive. Okay, we call this a struggle for existence, even though those seeds aren't actually fighting it out or battling. It just means that some will survive and others will not. Observation number 4. Members of a population vary extensively in their characteristics. In other words, no two individuals are exactly alike. Humans, of course, obviously we have the case of identical twins. But when you look at any population of organisms, from ants to fish to koala bears. They all have some very slight differences. If you looked at their DNA, it'd be even easier to see what those differences are. Here's an example of organisms you might look at and say, oh, they all look the same. Okay, ladybugs. But there are some slight variations among them. Now, there's a few black ones that are obvious here in the mix. But even the ones that have the 2 spots on them and are red, there are some differences. This one here is a little bit smaller. This one here tends to be a little bit bigger. This one here is a little bit more red. Their spots are different sizes. So even within a population like this, where they all might initially seem to look identical, there are differences between them. Okay, which brings us to number 5. That variation, those differences between them, is heritable. In other words, it's passed on through DNA. So put the rest of those together, and we have inference number 2. The survival of a species depends on inherited traits. Okay, so even if you just read that part, you're getting the gist of this here. So survival depends in part on inherited traits. In other words, those who get the traits that help them to survive will more than likely be the ones who reproduce and then leave more offspring behind because of that. Okay, so survival and reproduction happen more often in those individuals whose traits allow them to survive. That's our inference. And then finally, inference number 3. This unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce, in other words, some die and some don't, will lead to a gradual change in the population. So over time, our population of ladybugs is going to look more like the ones who survive better. Those favorable characteristics, back up. Again, those favorable characteristics, right here, that's what's important, will accumulate over generations. So those ones that have the traits that allow them to survive, those traits will show up more and more and more over the generations because those are the ones that help them survive and reproduce. All right, so hopefully those are a review pretty much of what we talked about with natural selection before. And I wanted you to have all those observations and inferences in your notebook, as I said. So if you need to go back and pause it or get some that you missed, please do that now. Okay, oftentimes with natural selection, we look at artificial selection at the same time because it's a good model of natural selection kind of in fast forward, moving a little bit more quickly. So in natural selection, as we just said, the environment determines which traits are favorable and therefore which organisms survive and which reproduce. So if the environment is favorable for that organism, whether it's the right temperature or the right amount of food or whatever, those organisms keep going and those traits get passed on. The other hand of that is artificial selection. Okay? In artificial selection, humans have modified the species, not the environment. So we have been doing the selection. So we're not letting organisms survive because they, do well because there's lots of sunlight or because there's good food amount. It's because we want them for some desired trait. Okay, whether that's little chihuahuas we want to have be really tiny and great big ears, or corn plants that we want to have good root structure so that they don't tip over. So those desired traits, whatever they are ones that we have chosen. Here's an example of some artificial selection. We have lots of plants that we have selected for to use as our food sources. So this one plant, this wild mustard, here in the center, okay, right here, is actually the progenitor or kind of like the ancestor of a whole bunch of different foods that we actually eat now. So over just 1,000 years or so, there's been enormous selection with humans choosing the types of plants that they want and those specific characteristics that those plants have. So we were able to cultivate wild mustard into cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi. All of those are basically because humans chose plants with certain traits of this wild mustard and kept breeding them over generations and generations, constantly picking those traits that they wanted to see, and eventually they got these various types of vegetables out of them. So you can see artificial selection by humans is really powerful. And natural selection, although it takes longer, can have the same effect and change species just as drastically. Okay, so just a little summary here of natural selection with 3 bullets that I want to make sure you understand. They're a little lengthy, so I'll try to paraphrase them for you. Natural selection, first of all, is differential success in reproduction. Okay, that area in red is probably the most important thing to remember. Differential success in reproduction means some survive, some do not. Okay? And remember then, of course, that the ones that survive have the heritable traits or the right DNA to survive in their environment. Number 2, over time, some organisms, those that survive, are going to increase in their adaptation to their environment. So in other words, they're going to become more and more fit for their environment because they are the ones that survive. And then number 3, if the environment would change over time, natural selection would result in these conditions as well. So if for a million years the environment was a certain way and favored certain types of species living there, if it would change over time, even if there was like a volcanic eruption or an earthquake or a drought, the environment is going to start to favor new types of species or new population traits. And so those species and those populations will change as well, depending on what kinds of pressures the environment puts on it. All right, with that, a couple of examples of some pretty cool organisms I think have gone through natural selection. This one is a type of mantid, like a praying mantis, and you can see it on this orchid right here. And it's amazing how well it is camouflaged in that orchid. And again, it's not like the mantid chose to look this way or anything like that. It's over a series of millions of years that mantids that looked more and more like the orchids were selected for. In other words, they survived better because they weren't getting picked off by their predators, probably some birds. And then they survived, passed on their traits, and had babies that looked more and more like these orchids. Same thing with this stick mantid. Okay, these are both mantids. This one's in a different environment though, and it has inherited different traits. Okay, different traits have been selected for and passed on because its environment was different. So again, it's pretty amazing how powerful natural selection can be, just as powerful as that example of the wild mustard with artificial selection that I gave earlier. Okay, so this is the end of this presentation. However, I do want you to also watch a video that I posted online as well. It's about natural selection, and it's got a link that says video of natural selection, and you can look that over as well. I think it's a really good explanation. It's about 7 minutes long, and I'd like you to watch that as well too to kind of round out your idea of natural selection.